The table was set beautifully. I had cooked for 3 hours. Jollof rice, fried plantains, and the pepper soup my mother always made on special occasions. My father told a joke, and everyone laughed. My sister Mercy reached over and squeezed my hand, like she always did. Dennis refilled his glass, and smiled at me from across the table. The way he had done, for 14 years. And I smiled back. What none of them knew was that I had spent the previous 72 hours sitting with an attorney named Patricia Orsini, going through 168 consecutive months of bank transfer records Dennis made to my father's account. Every single month. For 14 years. $1,200. Never missed a payment. More reliable than he had ever been, with me. They were all sitting at my table. Eating my food. Performing love. For a woman they had collectively decided was worth less than what Dennis was paying them, to stay quiet. I had one question I intended to ask, before the night was over. But first, let me take you back to the beginning. Because this story did not start at that dinner table. It started the day I met Dennis. When I was 26 years old. And still believed that family was the one thing in this world that money could never touch. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about almost everything. I grew up in a household where my father's word was the final word on everything. Not because he was cruel. He wasn't. Or at least, I never believed he was. But because that was simply the structure of our family. He decided. We adjusted. My mother supported his decisions publicly. Even when, in the quiet of the kitchen, while she washed dishes and I dried them, I could tell she wasn't entirely sure. We were not wealthy. But we were proud. My father worked in logistics. My mother cleaned offices in the evenings to supplement. And they raised 3 children who understood that loyalty to family was not optional. It was an identity. It was the thing you held on to when everything else became uncertain. I was the second born. Desmond was older than me by 3 years. Steady, responsible. The one my parents pointed to when they talked about how they had raised us right. Then me. Then Mercy, who is 2 years younger. We were close. I believed we were close. I met Dennis at a professional networking event in the city. He was 31. I was 26. He wore a dark suit and spoke with the kind of quiet confidence that reads, "In your 20s. As security." He was not flashy. He asked me questions and actually listened to the answers. He called when he said he would call. When I brought him home the first time, my father shook his hand for what felt like a full minute. That was my father's version of a standing ovation. My mother made his favorite dish. Before she even knew what his favorite dish was, she just guessed correctly, which felt like a sign. Desmond patted him on the shoulder. Mercy whispered to me in the kitchen that he had kind eyes. My entire family loved Dennis. Before I was certain that I did. Looking back, I have asked myself many times whether that should have been a warning sign. Whether the speed and unanimity of their approval was unusual. Whether a family as protective as mine should have needed more time. But I was 26. And I was in love. And my father had given his handshake. And that was enough. We married 14 months after we met. To understand why this story unfolded the way it did, you have to understand who I was inside my family. Not who I was at work. Or among friends. Who I was specifically. Within the structure of the people who raised me. I was the one who called every Sunday. I was the one who remembered every birthday without being reminded. And who noticed when my mother sounded tired on the phone. And drove 2 hours to check on her. Without announcing I was coming. I was the one who organized the Christmas gatherings. And kept the family group chat active. And mediated when my father and Desmond disagreed. About money or decisions. I was the one who believed. With a completeness that I now recognize. As both my greatest quality. And my most catastrophic vulnerability. That our family told each other the truth. Not because we were perfect. We weren't. We argued. We disappointed each other sometimes. Mercy and I went 6 months without speaking properly once. Over something neither of us can fully explain now. But beneath all of that, I believed the foundation was honest. I believed that if something was happening that I needed to know, someone would tell me. I believed my family's silence was always just silence. Not a purchased agreement. My mother used to say, that blood doesn't lie. She said it often enough that I filed it somewhere deep as an axiom. Something that didn't need to be verified. Because it had been repeated enough times to become true. My mother knew about Dennis's arrangement. By the 7th year of my marriage, she said nothing. For 7 more years. I want to be careful here. Because it would be easy and dishonest to look back at 14 years and construct a clean narrative of red flags. I obviously should have seen. The truth is messier than that. The doubts were real. But they were small. And they were spaced far enough apart that each one dissolved before the next one appeared. Year 2. Dennis took a work trip to a city 4 hours away and came back quieter than he had left. When I asked what was wrong, he said he was tired. I believed him because I had no reason not to. Year 4. My father paid off a debt he had mentioned to me several times over the previous decade. And when I asked how, he said he had been setting money aside, carefully. My father, who had never saved anything carefully in his life. I thought about it for a day. And then I stopped thinking about it. Year 6. Mercy stopped asking about Dennis the way she used to. Early in our marriage, she asked about him constantly. Was he treating me well? Was I happy? All the younger sister questions. Around year 6. She stopped. When I mentioned this to her, she said she was just giving us space as a couple. I accepted that. Year 8. I found a receipt in Dennis's coat pocket for a children's clothing store in a city we had never visited together, for sizes that did not correspond to any child either of us knew. When I asked, Dennis said it was a gift for a colleague's baby, and he had asked the store to size up. I did not ask which colleague. I do not know why. I did not ask which colleague. Year 11. Dennis's phone rang on a Saturday morning, and he took it outside. Without saying who was calling. He came back 15 minutes later and said it was his brother. His brother, whom I had spoken with at family gatherings for over a decade, never called on Saturday mornings. I noticed this, and I filed it in the same place I had filed all the other things. In a drawer. I had apparently decided was for items I was not ready to examine. None of these moments, in isolation, felt like evidence of anything. Each one had an explanation. I was willing to accept. But what I understand now is that the willingness to accept an insufficient explanation is not naivety. It is a choice made by someone who cannot afford, psychologically, for the explanation to be insufficient. I could not afford for Dennis to be lying, because Dennis was not just my husband. He was the man my entire family had approved of. And if Dennis was lying, the question that followed was one I was not yet equipped to ask. Desmond's health scare came without warning, the way those things always do. He called me on a Wednesday afternoon to say he was in the hospital, and that it was not serious, but that he wanted to see me. Something in his voice, a flatness I had never heard in my brother's voice before, told me to drive immediately. I told my office I had a family emergency, and I was in the car within 10 minutes. He was in a ward on the 4th floor. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him look. My brother, who had always seemed large in rooms, physically and in presence, looked like someone had let the air out of him. I sat in the chair beside his bed and held his hand and told him he was going to be fine. He said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything." I remember being cold immediately, before he said a single word of substance. I remember thinking, with the clarity that sometimes comes before impact, this is going to change something. He talked for 22 minutes. I know it was 22 minutes, because I watched the clock on the hospital wall behind him for the entire duration, needing something fixed and countable to hold on to. He told me that 4 months into my marriage, Dennis had approached my father privately. He told my father that he had a situation. Those were the words Desmond used. A situation from before he and I met. A woman. 2 children. He was not going to leave them. But he was not going to leave me either. He told my father that he wanted to ensure the family's discretion. He used the word discretion. And then he named a number. My father said yes. Desmond found out 8 months later, when he noticed a recurring deposit in my father's account, that my father eventually, under pressure, explained. Desmond confronted Dennis directly. Dennis doubled the offer and extended it to include Desmond. Desmond, who was carrying significant debt at the time, said yes. Mercy found out in year 3 and was brought into the arrangement by year 4. My mother knew by year 7. For the last 7 years of my marriage, every person in my immediate family had known that my husband had a second family. Every Sunday call, every birthday, every Christmas gathering I organized, every time my mother told me that Dennis was a good man, every time my father shook his hand, Desmond said, "I couldn't die without telling you. I tried to want the money more than I wanted you to know, and I couldn't do it anymore." He told me a name, Nancy, and a town. I held his hand for another few minutes. I told him I needed some air. I walked to the hospital bathroom, locked the door, sat on the floor, and pressed my back against the cold wall. I stayed there for a long time. Then I stood up. I washed my face. I went back to my brother's bedside, and I told him I loved him, and that I would handle everything from here. I asked him one question. Was he willing to put what he had just told me in writing? if I needed him to? He said yes, without hesitating. I drove home. I made dinner. Dennis came home at 7 and kissed me on the cheek and asked how Desmond was doing. He's going to be fine, I said. And I meant both of us. I did not sleep that night or the night after, but I did not cry either. I have thought about this since. Why there were no tears in those first 48 hours. And I think the answer is that grief requires some degree of surprise. And somewhere beneath 14 years of explanations I had accepted. I was not entirely surprised. I was devastated. But I was not surprised. On the Saturday after Desmond's confession, I told Dennis I was visiting a friend. I drove 2 hours in the direction of the town he had named. I did not have an address, only the town name and a woman's name. So I sat in a parking lot and searched social media with a patience I did not know I possessed. I found her in 40 minutes. Nancy, a woman approximately my age, warm-faced in her photographs, with 2 children who appeared to be 9 and 11 years old. Based on birthday posts I found, going back years. The 9-year-old had Dennis's nose. With a certainty. That made me grip my phone very hard for a moment. Her most recent post was tagged at a residential address in a quiet part of town. I drove there. I parked across the street. 40 minutes later, Dennis's car pulled into the driveway. He got out, and the 2 children ran to him from the front porch, in the way that children run toward someone they are completely certain of. He caught the younger one and lifted her. He put his arm around the older one's shoulders. Nancy appeared in the doorway, and Dennis kissed her in the comfortable, unhurried way of someone who has been doing it for years. I took photographs until I felt I had enough. Then I drove home. I stopped at a grocery store. I bought the ingredients for a meal I knew Dennis liked. I came home, and I cooked it, and I plated it beautifully, and I sat across from my husband at our dinner table, and I watched him eat. "This is incredible," he said. "Thank you," I said. That was the last normal evening I performed for Dennis. The following Monday morning, I called an attorney. Patricia Orsini had been recommended to me by a colleague at work, who had used her in a difficult property dispute. She was not a flashy attorney. Her office was efficient. Her manner was direct. And when I sat across from her and told her what I knew, she did not look shocked. She looked focused. "Tell me everything," she said. "And assume nothing is too small to mention." I told her everything. The 14 years of marriage. The payments. Desmond's confession and his willingness to formalize it. The photographs. The property records I had begun pulling online, which showed that Dennis co-owned Nancy's home, purchased 7 years into our marriage, using funds from accounts I had not been aware of. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He's been running 2 households financially for over a decade. That means there are assets that belong to this marriage that he has actively concealed. Before we file anything, I want you to go home and act completely normally for 3 more weeks while we build the full picture." 3 weeks. I nodded. I had already survived 14 years. 3 weeks was manageable. What followed was the most methodical period of my life. Patricia's team pulled financial records. I had legal access to, as his spouse. They found 3 accounts I did not know existed. They found the full history of transfers to my father. 168 payments. Organized in Dennis's records under a category he had labeled family support, which, in the most grotesque possible reading, was not technically incorrect. They found the deed to Nancy's home, the children's school fee payments, 2 life insurance policies, on which Nancy and her children, not I, were the named beneficiaries. Desmond came to Patricia's office with me on the 2nd week and gave his formal recorded statement. He did not flinch once. He answered every question, clearly and completely. When it was done, he looked at me in the corridor outside the office and said, "I'm sorry it took me this long." I told him that we would talk about everything when it was over. He nodded. By the end of the 3 weeks, we had a file that documented 14 years of Dennis's double life, in precise financial and legal detail. Patricia looked at me across her desk on the final preparation day and said, "You can file immediately, if you are ready." I told her. I had one dinner to get through first. There is a calculation I found myself doing in those 3 weeks. Not because my attorney asked me to, but because I needed to do it, for myself. $1,200 a month. Times 12 months. Times 14 years. $201,600. That was the price Dennis had assigned to my right to know the truth about my own life. That was the number my father had accepted. That was the amount my mother had chosen. Over the phone call. That would have changed everything. I am not a person who values money above most things. I want to be clear about that. The money itself was not the wound. The wound was the arithmetic of it. The evidence that a decision had been made. Consciously. And repeatedly. That Daniela's peace of mind was worth a fixed monthly sum. That her reality could be managed and maintained. Like a subscription service. Renewed every 30 days. For 14 years. Without a single lapse. I thought about every Sunday phone call with my mother. I thought about every time I had told her something difficult. In my marriage. A disagreement with Dennis. A moment of loneliness. A fear I could not quite name. And she had listened. And offered comfort. And never once said what she knew. I had given her every opportunity to tell me. And she had looked at those opportunities. And chosen the money. Every single time. I thought about Mercy, squeezing my hand at the table. I thought about what that squeeze was. Whether it was love. Or whether it was performance. Or whether, after enough years of performance, the two had become indistinguishable. Even to her. I thought about Desmond. Who had broken first. And I tried to hold both truths simultaneously. That he had waited too long. And that he had eventually chosen me over the money. And that both of these things were true. And neither canceled the other out. I cried during this period. I want to say that clearly. Because this story is not one of superhuman composure. I cried in my car. I cried in the shower. With the water running hot enough that Dennis would not hear anything. If he happened to be nearby. I cried at my desk at work. With the door closed. And my face arranged quickly. Before anyone knocked. But I did not collapse. I did not confront Dennis prematurely. I did not call my father. And shout into the phone. The way part of me wanted to. I dried my face. And I continued building the case. And I planned the dinner. I set the table the way my mother had taught me. To set a formal table. I cooked for 3 hours. I sent the invitations as though it were any ordinary gathering. Sunday dinner, everyone come. I'll cook. They all arrived. My father first. Then my mother on his arm. Then Mercy. Then Dennis, coming from the direction of the kitchen, where he had been opening wine. Desmond arrived last. And sat beside me, which I had asked him to do. We ate. The food was good. The conversation moved the way it always moved. My father's stories. My mother's comments. Mercy's laughter. Dennis was relaxed. He had no reason not to be. About 40 minutes in, I stood up quietly and went to the kitchen. I came back with a manila folder, and I set it in the center of the table, between the serving dishes. The table went quiet, in the organic way that tables go quiet when something unusual appears. I sat back down. I looked at my father. Daddy, I said, can you explain to me what service you provided Dennis? That he paid you $1,200 a month for 168 consecutive months? The silence that followed was unlike any silence I had ever sat in. My father looked at the folder. He looked at Dennis. Dennis's hand moved toward the folder, and I placed my hand on it first. Calmly. Without drama. Just my hand, flat on the manila cover. There is a copy for everyone, I said. Patricia has the originals. My mother called my name. Just my name. The way she had called it, my entire life. And I looked at her. And I think she knew at that moment that there was no version of this conversation in which she could explain her way to the other side. Dennis began to speak. I looked at him for a moment. Really looked at him. The way you look at something. You are finally ready to stop carrying. And then I looked at my mother. And my father. And Mercy. I'm not here for an argument, I said quietly. I'm not here for explanations either. Patricia has everything she needs. I just wanted to ask the question, in person. Because I think I deserved at least that much. I set the folder down in the center of the table. There is a copy for each of you. I picked up my glass, finished what was left of my wine, and set it down gently. I thanked everyone for coming. I said goodnight to my mother, the way I had said goodnight to her my entire life, because I did not yet know how to say it any other way. Then I walked to the door, and I let myself out. Desmond followed a few minutes later. He found me sitting on the front step, in the dark. He sat down beside me, without saying anything. And we stayed like that, for a while. Two people who had grown up in the same house. Finally on the same side of the truth. The divorce took 7 months. Dennis's attorney attempted several maneuvers. Denial. Then minimization. Then an argument that the concealed assets predated our marriage, in ways that were quickly dismantled by Patricia's documentation. The 3 hidden accounts were fully surfaced during discovery. The property he co-owned with Nancy, purchased with marital funds, was included in the settlement calculation. Dennis did not emerge from the process financially comfortable. Nancy, for her part, had not known Dennis was still married. She had believed, for 14 years, a version of Dennis that was equally constructed and equally false. when her attorney made contact with Patricia to clarify her position. There was a strange and painful solidarity in learning that Dennis had managed to fully deceive two women simultaneously. She and I have never spoken directly. I do not know that we ever will. But I do not carry anything toward her. I carry quite a lot toward Dennis. I have decided. With the guidance of a therapist I began seeing during the divorce process, that carrying it is honest, and that I am allowed to carry it for as long as I need to, without performing forgiveness for anyone's comfort. My father called me several times in the months after the dinner. I did not answer. He sent a letter. I read it once and filed it in a place where I do not have to look at it. My mother sent Mercy to speak with me on her behalf. I told Mercy that I loved her, and that I could not have a relationship with her right now, and that I did not know if that would ever change, and that both of those things were true simultaneously. Desmond and I speak every week, sometimes twice. He has apologized more times than I can count. And at some point I told him that the apologies were less useful to me than his continued presence and honesty. And so that is what we have built. A relationship constructed on honesty now, which means it is the only relationship in my family that I currently trust with anything real. I moved into a new apartment 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized. Smaller than what I had before, with better light. I hung nothing on the walls for the first month, because I was not yet sure what I wanted to look at every day. Eventually I bought a piece of art by a woman I had never met from a market, because I liked it, and because I owed nothing to its history. I am not going to tell you that I am healed. I am not going to perform a triumphant ending that the reality doesn't quite support yet. What I can tell you is that I sleep differently now. There is a specific quality of sleep that is only available to someone who knows the truth of their own life. And I have access to that now, in a way I did not have before, even when everything around me looked fine. My mother used to say that blood doesn't lie. I have a different saying now, one I wrote for myself in a journal I keep on my nightstand. The truth does not require your permission. It only requires time, and someone finally willing to say it out loud. Desmond said it out loud. He said it late and imperfectly, and from a hospital bed, with his own mortality pressing down on him. But he said it, and I built the rest from there. This is Daniela. Wherever you are watching this from, if you are sitting with a silence you have been explaining away for years, I want you to know that the explanation is not the truth. The truth is still there, underneath it, waiting. You are allowed to go looking for it, and you are allowed to survive what you find.